The Prophet Rev2. 10 years after releasing the very successful Prophet 8, Dave Smith updates it to the Rev2. The Rev2 is a polyphonic analog synthesizer, and finally it's priced relatively competitively to its peers. Let's check it out and see what it's got. This is the desktop version, which has exactly the same features as the Rev2 with the keyboard, but it's slightly cheaper and takes up much less space. I prefer this one because you can put it on a stand in an angle, and I can hook up any MIDI keyboard that I want to it. If I want a small one, that works well, and if I want to go bigger, I can. Whatever keyboard you do choose to hook up, make sure that it is velocity and aftertouch sensitive, because these can be modulation sources in the Rev2. I did try out the 61 key version of the Rev2, and the keyboard is really nice, but for me personally, this is the way to go. Whichever Rev2 you choose, they come in two versions, an 8-voice and 16-voice version, and if you want, you can start with the 8-voice version and then upgrade it to the 16-voice for about $100 more than what it would cost you to buy the 16-voice version in the first place. In terms of pricing, the Rev2 is priced fairly competitively. If you compare it to the new Korg Prologue, the 8 and 16 voice versions with the keyboard, it costs the same. The 8-voice Rev2 desktop costs as much as the Novation Peak, which is also a comparative synth. I hope to do some competitive versus videos in the future, but for now let's focus on this. The Prophet Rev2 comes with over 500 factory presets made especially for it, and you can also download the old Prophet 08 presets onto it, and there are over 250 of those on the Dave Smith website. So in total, you get over 750 presets out of the box to get you started. And obviously you've got a lot of tools to create your own presets or to modify the existing ones however you like. Now I'm going to cover Rev2 sound design in detail, but overall it's noteworthy that this is very much knob per function. So what you see is pretty much what you get. There is some many driving for additional features, but most of the things are easily one touch away. Just as an example, if I want to route LFO number 1 to the cutoff knob, all I have to do is press it and turn the knob, and I've created this association. Another important feature of the Rev2 is that it's multi-timbral. Whether you get the 8-voice or the 16-voice version, you can have two different splits on the keyboard or layer sounds one on top of the other. In either case, either split or layer gets half of the voices. So let me give you an example. Here I've got one layer which sounds like this, and another layer which sounds like this, and I can split them or stack them. Think of the layering in terms of basically doubling everything you see here. Obviously you get half the voices per layer, but in terms of modulation options, envelopes, and so on, you get basically two synths. If you want, you also have two outputs for each of the layers. So if you hook up two MIDI keyboards, you can basically invite a friend and you have two Rev2s at your disposal. In terms of sequencing, the Rev2 has two different types of sequencers, a polyphonic sequencer, which has up to 64 steps, and a gated sequencer. This one has only 16 steps, but it's multi-layer. So let me explain. So let's start with the polyphonic sequencer, which is easier to explain. Just hit record, and now I'm step recording, so I don't need to record in time, and playback is step after step. And now my sequence is playing back. I can play over it if I have enough voices free. And it's a 6-voice polyphonic sequencer. Now, remember I said there are two layers, so we can actually create a sequence per layer, and each layer can have its own tempo. So for example, on this layer I have some percussion, and I can sequence that separately. Sequencing is velocity sensitive, by the way. Okay, that should be good enough. So that's a very simple percussion sequence, but now I can stack the layers. And since each layer can have its own tempo, I can, for example, double the tempo of this one. Now we'll get to effects in a bit. The percussion layer has too much reverb, so you can control that separately. So it's really easy to create two polyphonic sequences and edit all their parameters while they're playing back. And if you want, you can go step by step and edit each of the 6 tracks. This is a bit cumbersome, obviously. There's also software which you can purchase from a company called Sound Tower that lets you edit the sequence on a computer. And you can also sequence ties and rests. The gated sequencing mode is a really interesting one. It only has 16 steps, but you have 4 tracks that you can assign to pretty much anything here, whether it's notes or parameters. You can only enter steps in the menu though. It would have been nice to at least enter notes with the keyboard, and I'm sure that's something that can be handled in a firmware update, but right now you've got to handle each and every one of the steps through the menus. So let's just take, for example, this one has a nice gated sequence. So we've got a sequence affecting the cutoff, oscillator mix, noise, resonance, and each one in different ways. So you can create some pretty interesting things with this. Another nice feature is that each of the 4 lanes can be different lengths, and steps can either be individual values, or you can turn 2 tracks into slew type tracks where values glide from one to the other. So here the software from Sound Tower can come in and be even more handy. You can see that you've got really nice control over each of the 4 tracks. You can edit notes if you like, or values. The gated sequencer can either be free running like this, or work on a step-by-step basis in key step mode. I think this is one of the more unique and compelling features of the Rev2. And you can accomplish all this with the menus, but the software is a lot more usable. Rev2 also has an arpeggiator, pretty standard stuff, with a hold mode if you like, and the standard arpeggiator options. Okay, let's move on to sound design. So let's start with a basic sound design overview. You have, per voice, 2 oscillators, a sub-oscillator, and a noise generator. A low-pass filter, which can be either 4-pole or 2-pole. 3 envelopes, 1 for the filter, another an amp envelope, and an auxiliary envelope, which you can route anywhere you like, and 4 LFOs. Now, the envelopes and the LFOs can be routed to multiple destinations. So this is not just a filter envelope. You can route it to anywhere you want. There's a mod matrix with 8 slots which you can customize, and then it has also 5 additional inputs for modulation, velocity, aftertouch, and so on. So let's start with the oscillators. There's saw and triangle, and pulse. Now don't worry about this. There's a shape mod per oscillator. So the sawtooth shapes like this. That's saw plus triangle. Triangle morphs like this. And pulse obviously has pulse width. So it's sort of like a mini wavetable synth for each and every one of the shapes. Now, one of the first things you might want to do is assign an LFO to the shape mod. So that's pretty straightforward. You hit the LFO button and then hold the shape mod knob. And now you've got shape modulation, in this case for the pulse width, but you can apply that to any of the shapes. Let's lower that for now. You've got coarse tuning and fine tuning. You've got 2 oscillators per voice and a mixer that lets you control their relative levels. Sub-oscillator. Noise, if you want. And slop brings some alcohol into the mix. This ever so slightly changes the stability of the tuning of the oscillators. There's also oscillator sync. For hard sync effects. Of course, you can modulate this as well. There's also an FM synthesis option. We'll get to that when we get to the filter, which is now. So the filter has 2 modes, 4-pole 24 dB per octave, or 2-pole 12 dB per octave. There's resonance, which can self-oscillate in the 4-pole mode. In 2-pole mode, the resonance is much more subtle. It's still there, but much more subtle. So these are the only 2 modes. There isn't a bandpass or high-pass filter. There is a high-pass filter effect, which is applied to the entire layer. We'll get to that when we get to the effects, but overall, just a low-pass filter. Let's talk about filter cutoff modulation. You've got a 5-stage envelope, which is really cool. You've got delay, which is the time it takes for the envelope to start, and then attack, decay, sustain, and release. The purpose of modulation is to make our sound not static, and envelopes help shape it over time. So I can affect the filter cutoff point with this envelope. It can go positive or negative. Velocity lets me introduce modulation through the velocity of the keys. So the harder I press, the farther out the filter cutoff goes. If I press lightly, it goes up just a bit. If I press hard, it modulates it much more based on this knob. By default, the filter cutoff doesn't track the keys, but you can add key tracking here so that you can control the filter cutoff point with the keys as well. Let me turn all these values down to explain key tracking. I'll lower the oscillator as well. So by default, the filter cutoff point isn't related to which key I press, but I can introduce key tracking, and at 64, the filter cutoff point will track the keys precisely. And what we get here is a really nice sine wave, which lends itself nicely to FM, and that's what the audio mod knob lets us do. Basically what that does is take oscillator 1 and use that to modulate the frequency of the cutoff point. And that's a nice way to get those bell-like FM synth sounds. You can play around with the different ratios of modulation to get different tones. So that was the filter. Let's move on to our amplitude envelope. And again, it's a 5-stage envelope with delay before the ADSR. So release is how long a note lasts after you leave it. Attack is the speed until that it takes it to get to the maximum volume. Decay is a time it takes it to get to the sustain level. So standard stuff. There's also pan spread. And if you're listening to this in stereo, you can hear the notes start to travel around. Amp envelope, same thing. The level at which the ADSR affects the volume, and then velocity, just like in the filter. Lets me control the strength of a note based on the velocity at which I press a key. Now, remember, I can route these envelopes anywhere I want using the mod matrix, but there's another third envelope that we can use to route anywhere else. So let's, for example, take the pitch of the oscillators as a modulation destination. You can affect it either positive or negatively. And with delay, you can have the effect be applied a while after you press the key. So standard stuff, and there's a variety of destinations here. Now, beside that, you can also loop this envelope. So it does require a menu item here, but let me find it, and that is right here. Envelope 3 repeat. So if I turn this on, it'll repeat. Now it'll go through the delay, attack, and decay settings. Can get pretty fast. Decay will go to the sustain level. And then release will happen when I leave the note. So that's the auxiliary envelope. I'll skip the effects for now because they're per layer and not per voice, and hop right to the LFOs. You've got 4 LFOs, and this is per voice. You can set the frequency of each one. You see the frequency at which it blinks here, which corresponds to the frequency of the LFO. And you can route these LFOs to multiple destinations. You can route them using either the destination knob or by touching the LFO and touching the destination knob. So here I want to apply this LFO to the cutoff point. So it's working per voice, and you can have it key synced. So now I press the keys together, all the LFOs are running together, or if I press the keys separately, they'll run separately. You can have the rate independent or synced to the BPM, in which case it's in ratios to the BPM. And amount, of course, will determine the modulation depth. And then I can have another LFO apply, let's say, to vibrato. So I'll connect it to this oscillator. Maybe we'll tone this down for a bit. So now this is creating vibrato, and I need to just set the amount. And now I have vibrato. So that's the basic idea of LFOs. You've got two more that you can route anywhere else you like. And then you've got the mod matrix, where you can choose any one of 8 slots and assign a source, destination, and modulation amount to each of those slots. And then there are slots for mod wheel, pressure, breath control, velocity, and MIDI foot controller. So let's take, for example, the mod wheel, and I want to assign that to, let's add an amount and assign that to the filter cutoff. Now you can see I can open up the filter. Or close it with this. Now, you can assign the sources, destinations, and amounts through the menus here, but there are shortcuts just by holding a key. Let's say I want to choose the third envelope as a source. Just touch anywhere there. Let's say I want the attack of this envelope to be the destination, and then all I have to do is just set the amount here. So that's how you program the mod slots. Very straightforward and easy. Let's move on to the effects section. So there are a variety of effects options. Each layer gets one effect that you can choose from. The effects are all digital, and you have 2 parameters per effect. So for example, delay, feedback, and time. You've got a few delays, stereo delay, and you've got a mix knob to mix between the analog and digital effect signals. Analog style bucket brigade delay is always fun. There's chorus. Phaser. And 2 more types of phasers. Two flangers. There's a reverb. That's nice. It doesn't quite go as big as I'd like it to. And there's no shimmer style effects to it. But it does the basic job. There's a ring mod effect. Distortion. And then there's the high pass filter. Again, this is a global layer effect, not a per voice effect. It does have resonance though. So that's it for the effects section. I've got a few more cool things to show you. Unison lets you layer voices one on top of the other and then detune them. Now, unfortunately, this is all or nothing for the layer, so you can't play polyphonically, only monophonically with all these voices. But that is 16 Prophet Rev2 voices playing in unison. Now, I was only running 1 oscillator per voice there, so it can get even crazier. Aside from unison, you also have glide controls. And what's nice about this is that you can control glide per oscillator in each voice. There are a few more options here in the global menu. I think one that may be interesting to a few people is the alternative tunings. I find it hard enough to play and tune as is, so this isn't as compelling for me, but it's there if you want it. In terms of connectivity, you've got headphone outs, stereo outputs, and then outputs for the second layer if you want. You've got CV or expression pedal inputs, sustain pedal inputs, and you can move the sequencer along with voltages. You've got MIDI in, out, and through. USB for MIDI only. Doesn't send sound out, unfortunately. And then power and an on-off switch. One last thing that I want to talk about is the companion software by Sound Tower. Now, this is it is an additional purchase. It isn't bundled with the Rev2, but it does have a few nice features. First is just the ability to select presets from the computer screen. Second is if I go to the knob settings menu, you can see as I flip through the different presets on the Rev2, the screen updates accordingly. And it's nice to see all the knob positions and envelopes directly on the screen. The top half represents layer A and the bottom layer B. And that applies across the various tabs. As I showed you before, you have access to the sequencer, which is really helpful. So you can make changes to it, mess it up as you wish. So this is the view to the polyphonic sequencer, and you also have a view into the gated sequencer, like I showed you before when we talked about the gated sequencer. A really nifty feature of this software is the genetics or morphing functions. So the idea here is that I can choose a preset, let's say this one, and then let's take another one, let's take this guy for example, and then either mix, so have steps that are mixed in between them or morphed in between them. So let's say take this one for example. So it's sort of, if you look at this as the starting point and this is the end point, you've got all the sounds in between. Sometimes it can be funky, sometimes it can be silent or not work at all, but occasionally you'll get an interesting step in between two presets. And you also have a this on a sort of morpher display. So let's take two different presets. Let's take this one and this one, right? So two completely different presets, and then pick any step in between to get sort of a mix of what their they call this children, what their children might look like. So this review may have been a bit too long, but what I expect in a review is an idea of what it feels like to own an instrument. And hopefully this gives you a bit of that. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comment section below. If you want to see more, click the subscribe button. Hit like if you liked it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.